March 17, 1943. The North Atlantic heaves beneath a gray sky, 40-foot waves rising and collapsing in endless rhythm. Convoy HX-229, 41 merchant ships carrying 140,000 tons of supplies, pushes east toward Britain through sleet and spray. Every man aboard knows they're being hunted. In the galley of the Liberty ship, SS William Eustis, 28-year-old cook, Thomas "Tommy" Lawson, braces himself against the rolling deck, washing dishes that slide like ice across the steel counter. Up on the bridge, Captain James Bannerman studies the horizon through salt-fogged binoculars. Somewhere out there, beneath the surface, the U-boats are waiting. 600 yards off the convoy's port beam, deep below the waves, Capitan Lieutenant Helmut Manch sits in the control room of U-758. The lights are dim, the air thick with diesel and sweat. A hydrophone operator leans into his headphones and murmurs. Contact bearing 280, multiple screws, heavy tonnage. Manch smiles. He's found them. Above him, 41 ships thunder through the water, each one broadcasting its position to the enemy through the roar of its engines. Over the next 6 days, 22 of those ships will vanish beneath the Atlantic. 300 merchant sailors will drown in freezing darkness. It will become the worst convoy disaster since 1942. And in Berlin, Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the German submarine fleet, will call it the greatest convoy battle of all time. But in that moment, neither Bannerman nor Manch could know that the fate of the Atlantic War was about to turn, because of one man who didn't belong on any list of heroes. A ship's cook with no degree, no rank, and an idea no engineer had ever considered. Tommy Lawson wasn't supposed to change history. He'd left school at 14, flipped eggs in a South Boston diner, and joined the Merchant Marine at 26, only because the pay, $125 a month, was triple what he made at home. The evaluation in his file read, adequate performance, no leadership potential. Nobody expected genius from the man who fried bacon. Yet Lawson had a habit that made his crewmates shake their heads. During off-watch hours, he'd wander down to the engine room, crouch beside the roaring turbines, and simply listen. The chief engineer, a gruff Scotsman named Donald MacLeod, would yell over the noise, "Get back to your galley, cook. You'll go deaf down here." But Lawson wasn't there out of curiosity. He was listening to the ship itself. One February night, midway across the Atlantic, a torpedo struck a freighter 2 columns over. Lawson heard the explosion through the hull, but what caught his attention wasn't the blast. It was what came after. A deep, hollow boom, then nothing. The sound of the ship died as seawater rushed in. For a few seconds, there was absolute silence. In that silence, Tommy Lawson heard a revelation. If a flooded ship stopped making noise because the water absorbed vibration, what would happen if you used that same principle deliberately? Could water itself silence a ship's machinery? Could a little flooding save lives instead of ending them? He tried to explain it to MacLeod. So what if we flood part of the ship on purpose, just a small chamber near the engines, to muffle the sound? MacLeod blinked, then laughed. That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. Water inside a ship, cook, is called sinking. But Lawson couldn't let it go. Night after night, he filled a greasy notebook with sketches, improvised ballast tanks, sealed drums filled with seawater around the propeller shaft, flexible bladders near the engine mounts. He wasn't thinking like an engineer. He was thinking like a man who listened. Every vibration had a tone, every hum, a shape, and somewhere in that noise lay the key to survival. If you enjoy hearing the real stories behind the war, the kind history books forgot, please subscribe to the channel. And tell us what you think in the comments below. Your thoughts and support truly help us keep making more stories like this. By mid-March 1943, British Naval Command in Liverpool was desperate. U-boats were sinking more tonnage than Allied shipyards could replace. Prime Minister Winston Churchill would later admit, The only thing that truly frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril. The Atlantic lifeline, the supply artery keeping Britain alive, was bleeding out. In secret conferences, admirals and scientists debated propeller redesigns, rubber coatings, sound-dampening mounts. Every idea cost millions or required shipyard time Britain didn't have. Experts declared it impossible to make a merchant ship quiet enough to hide from a submarine's hydrophones. The consensus was brutal. The Atlantic could not be silenced. And while they wrote reports, a cook on a Liberty ship kept sketching. He couldn't know it yet, but those rough drawings in a stained notebook would soon rewrite the rules of naval warfare and prove that sometimes the man who washes the dishes can hear what the admirals never will. March 24, 1943, Liverpool, England. The William Eustace docked at dawn, her hull scarred by the Atlantic. While the crew staggered down the gangway toward pubs and shore leave, Tommy Lawson carried something else ashore. The notebook he'd been filling with diagrams for weeks. He'd decided that if no one aboard his ship would listen, maybe someone in the Royal Navy would. He walked straight through the rain-soaked streets to Western Approach's command headquarters, the nerve center of Britain's Atlantic defense, where hundreds of officers plotted convoy routes and hunted submarines across a wall-sized map. He wasn't invited. He wasn't even supposed to be anywhere near the building. When Lawson reached the front steps, 2 shore patrolmen stopped him. "Sorry, mate, this is restricted," one said, eyeing his merchant uniform. "I need to talk to someone about convoy noise," Lawson insisted. "I've got an idea." "Everyone's got an idea," the guard said, grabbing his arm. "Now clear off." They were escorting him back toward the street when a young Royal Navy officer, thin, exhausted, in salt-stained blues, stepped into the lobby. He'd just returned from the disastrous convoy ONS-5, where 13 merchant ships had been lost to U-boats. His name was Commander Peter Gretton, and he looked like a man who hadn't slept in weeks. "What did you say about convoy noise?" he asked. Lawson turned, startled. "Sir, the submarines hear us because our ships are too loud. Machinery vibrations, propeller noise. It travels through the hull into the ocean. But when a ship floods, the sound stops. What if we used water to muffle the noise before it reaches the sea?" Gretton crossed his arms, studying the American cook. "That's the most ridiculous thing I've heard this month," he said flatly. "Water inside a ship is called sinking." "Not if you control it," Lawson shot back. "Small chambers, sealed, near the engine mounts or the propeller shaft. You don't flood the ship, you isolate the noise." For a long moment, Gretton said nothing. He'd heard dozens of hopeless theories, from radar reflections to seaweed coatings, but something in the cook's eyes stopped him. "Say that again," Gretton murmured. "Water absorbs vibration better than air," Lawson explained. "If we put water where the sound starts, it can't travel through the hull." Gretton frowned. "You're talking about acoustic insulation." "Exactly," Lawson said. Gretton looked down at the notebook, its pages smeared with grease and pencil. "Come with me." That afternoon, Gretton led Lawson through the gates of Liverpool Dockyard to a small corvette named HMS Sunflower, battered, leaking, but in dry dock for repairs. "If this works," Gretton said, "and I doubt it will, we test it here. Quietly. No one in London needs to know." The engineer assigned to Sunflower, Lieutenant James Whitby, listened to the plan and shook his head. "We'll get court-martialed for this, sir." Gretton shrugged. "If it fails, no one will ever know. If it works..." He didn't finish the sentence. They started immediately. Working through freezing rain and rationed daylight, the 3 men built a crude prototype using whatever materials they could find. Old oil drums were cut open and welded around the propeller shaft housing. They filled them with seawater to act as sound barriers. Sandbags were stacked around the engine mounts to simulate water-filled weight. It was ugly, improvised, and completely unauthorized. March 28, 1943. The Sunflower eased out into the Mersey River under low power. A British submarine, HMS Trespasser, waited half a mile away, hydrophones active. Lawson stood on deck, breathless, while Gretton watched the horizon. Minutes later, Trespasser surfaced and flashed a signal light. "Heard you clearly. Engine noise same as before." "Failure," Whitby muttered. "Told you it was bloody stupid." But Lawson wasn't ready to quit. He leaned over the rail, staring down at the welded drums. "They're leaking," he said. "We filled them when she was in dry dock. They've drained out." He looked at Gretton. "We need to seal them, make them watertight." Gretton rubbed his forehead. "If the Admiralty finds out I've been modifying a warship based on a cook's idea, they'll have my head." Lawson's voice was quiet, but sharp. "If the Admiralty finds out we're still losing 20 ships a week because we're too proud to test something new, they'll have the whole Atlantic." The words hung in the air. Gretton stared at him, then exhaled. 3 more days, then this madness ends." 3 days, Lawson said. "That's all I need." They worked without sleep. Whitby fabricated new sealed steel chambers and fitted them tight around the shaft housing. Lawson scavenged rubber bladders from damaged lifeboats, filled them with water, and wedged them against the engine mounts to absorb vibration. By the time they finished, the Sunflower looked like a floating experiment in insanity, a patchwork of welded drums and improvised plumbing. But it was ready. April 2nd, 1943. The second test began at dawn. Sunflower ran her engines at full power, her hull trembling with effort. Half a mile away, Trespasser submerged again, hydrophones tuned. For minutes, no signal came, then a flash. "Lost you at 400 yards. Detection impossible beyond that range." Whitby's jaw dropped. Gretton went pale. Lawson just whispered, "It works." For the first time in 3.5 years of war, a ship had gone quiet beneath the ocean. April 3rd, 1943. London, Admiralty Boardroom. The rain outside drummed against the tall windows as 3 men waited in the corridor. Commander Peter Gretton, Lieutenant James Whitby, and the cook who had turned a corvette into a science experiment, Thomas Patrick Lawson. Inside the boardroom sat the most powerful officers in the British Navy: Admiral Sir Max Horton, commander of Western Approaches; Captain Edmund Rushbrook, director of Naval Intelligence; and Dr. Harold Burris, the very architect who had written the paper explaining why it was physically impossible to silence a ship. The doors opened. A clerk motioned them in. "Commander Gretton, explain this." "Unauthorized modification," Horton said without preamble. Gretton placed a thin folder of test results on the table. "Sir, our submarine trials show hydrophone detection range reduced from 12 miles to less than 400 yards. That's a 97% reduction in acoustic signature." Captain Rushbrook raised an eyebrow. "You're telling me a corvette vanished from sonar because you welded oil drums to it?" "Yes, sir," Gretton replied evenly. Dr. Burris adjusted his glasses. "This is absurd. You've violated multiple naval regulations, risked the stability of a warship, and for what? The suggestion of a—" He looked at Lawson's uniform. "A cook?" Gretton didn't flinch. "A cook who may have just solved the problem your department said couldn't be solved." The room went silent. Admiral Horton turned to Lawson. "Mr. Lawson, explain to me, simply, what you've done." Lawson swallowed hard. "Sir, ship engines and propellers send vibrations through the steel hull into the water. The U-boats hear that. But water absorbs vibration better than metal or air. So we created sealed chambers, filled with seawater, around the noisiest parts of the ship. The water acts like a buffer. It traps the sound before it escapes." Burris scoffed. "Water inside a hull introduces weight imbalance, corrosion, and structural stress. You're trading noise for instability." "Not if it's controlled," Lawson said quietly. sealed, balanced. We're not flooding the ship, we're silencing it. Rushbrook leaned forward. And how long did you spend on this miraculous breakthrough? 3 days, Lawson said. 3 days? Burris repeated, incredulous. Gentlemen, the Admiralty has spent 3 years on this problem, and we're to believe this culinary savant has solved it in 3 days with plumbing parts. Horton raised a hand. Enough. Dr. Burris, you may be correct, but we've lost over 500,000 tons of shipping this month. We're running out of time and ships. He turned to Gretton. What would it take to retrofit a convoy? Less than a week, sir, Gretton said. 6 ships, 2 days each. All we need are welders and basic materials. Rushbrook shook his head. Admiral, this would divert resources from escort production. It's untested, unproven. It's working, Gretton interrupted. We have proof. The submarine couldn't hear us past 400 yards. If this can be replicated, it changes everything. Horton stared out the window for a long moment, the silence heavy. Then he said, Commander Gretton, retrofit 6 merchant ships in the next convoy, on 184. Mr. Lawson, you will oversee installation and train the engineers. Dr. Burris, you will observe and verify results. If it works, we implement it fleet-wide. If it fails, he turned toward Gretton. You'll spend the rest of the war sweeping mines off Orkney. Gretton straightened. Understood, sir. Horton looked at Lawson last. Mr. Lawson, I don't know whether you're a genius or a madman, but we're desperate enough to find out. Don't make me regret this. Lawson nodded. I won't, sir. April 11th, 1943, Liverpool dockyards. Welders worked around the clock. Sparks flew through the night as 6 Liberty ships were modified. The Daniel Webster, James Herod, John Davenport, Samuel Eliot, Benjamin Key, and Lawson's own William Eustace. Teams welded cylindrical steel drums 24 inches across around the propeller shafts, then filled them with seawater. Rubber bladders were installed against engine mounts, absorbing vibration. The entire process took 60 hours per vessel, a fraction of the time anyone expected. It was crude engineering, but the tests were undeniable. Before modification, hydrophones could detect a Liberty ship at 11 miles. After modification, less than half a mile. The ships were 29 times quieter. When the dockyard crews finished, the engineers stood back and stared at the odd, pipe-riddled machinery. One muttered, "Looks like someone plumbed a brewery into a warship." Lawson smiled faintly. Maybe that's what it takes to beat the U-boats. A little plumbing. These stories take weeks to research and produce, and we share them so that the sacrifices of men like this aren't forgotten. If you'd like to see more, please subscribe and leave your opinion in the comments. We read everyone, and it truly helps us continue this work. April 22nd, 1943. Convoy on 184 steamed out of Liverpool. 43 merchant ships in 9 columns, guarded by 6 corvettes and 2 destroyers. Among them, 6 vessels carried the secret modification that almost no one in the Admiralty believed in. The plan was simple. Spread the modified ships throughout the formation. 2 on the port flank, 2 starboard, 2 center. If U-boats attacked, the results would speak for themselves. German naval intelligence had already picked up the convoy's departure. 37 submarines of Wolfpack Mysa took position across the expected route, ready to strike. As the convoy pushed west into the gray Atlantic, no one aboard those ships knew they were part of an experiment that would change the course of the war. Only a handful of men, a commander, a cook, and a handful of engineers understood what was at stake. April 25th, 1943, Mid-Atlantic, 2:14 a.m. Wind howled over the black water as convoy on 184 plowed west through 30-foot waves. The moon was gone, hidden behind clouds. Only the pale wakes of the merchantmen marked their path across the ocean. Somewhere below them, steel ghosts listened. Aboard U-264, Kapitan Lieutenant Hartwig Lux leaned over the glowing chart table. His hydrophone operator, Cleon, pressed the earpieces tight against his head, eyes closed. Convoy bearing 290, contact weakening, Herr Kaleon, signal intermittent. Lux frowned. Intermittent? That's impossible. Either you hear a convoy or you don't. Cleon hesitated. Some ships strong at 40 kilometers. Others vanish at 5. The captain adjusted his glasses, irritated. Maybe your equipment is failing. No, sir, the operator whispered. It's strange. The loud ships are in clusters. Between them, silence. Lux ordered the submarine up to periscope depth. Through the wet lens he could see it, a wall of merchantmen cutting through the night, their dim running lights flickering in the rain. But when he pressed his earphones back on, half the convoy was gone. 6 ships, scattered through the columns, produced no sound at all. What kind of trick is this? He muttered. He gave the order to attack anyway. Target the loudest, those we can hear. Beneath the waves, U-264 slid into firing position. Torpedoes hissed through the dark. Minutes later, explosions rocked the convoy's starboard flank. 2 ships hit, one breaking apart in flame. But the 6 modified vessels passed silently through the chaos, invisible to the hydrophones that guided German torpedoes. April 27, 1943, 600 miles west of Ireland. The Wolfpack struck again. 19 U-boats converged on convoy on 184, surfacing at night to attack from the edges. For 18 hours, the battle raged, flares arcing into the sky, tracers whipping across the waves. When it ended, 9 merchant ships were gone. 47,000 tons of cargo sank into the freezing Atlantic. Over 3,000 sailors drifted in lifeboats, waiting for rescue. It was another brutal engagement, except for one detail. Of the 9 ships destroyed, not one was among the 6 fitted with Lawson's water-filled chambers. Every modified vessel made it through untouched. Commander Gretton radioed London the next day. Modified ships showed 0 enemy contact, despite comparable convoy positions. Acoustic dampening effective under combat conditions. Recommend immediate expansion. In Liverpool, Admiral Horton read the message twice, then passed it to Dr. Burris without a word. The scientist scanned the report, pale. It's impossible. Apparently not, Horton said. Get me production numbers. May 12, 1943. Admiralty Statistical Division, London. For the first time in the war, the graphs turned in Britain's favor. Before Lawson's experiment, U-boats could hear a convoy from over 11 nautical miles away. Each Wolfpack engagement cost the Allies nearly 1/3 of their ships. After the modifications, hydrophone detection range had collapsed to less than a mile. Convoy losses dropped by 85%. More important, the hunters were now the hunted. U-boats had to approach dangerously close, within visual range of escorts, to find their targets. Radar picked them up. Depth charges followed. May 24, 1943. Black May. The name would enter naval history. That month, Allied forces sank 41 German submarines, a quarter of Donitz's operational fleet. Merchant losses fell to 58 ships, almost half the number lost 2 months earlier. In his war diary, Admiral Karl Dönitz wrote, "The enemy has achieved technical supremacy and acoustic concealment. Convoys have become nearly invisible to hydrophones. Our boats can no longer predict attack positions. The ocean itself has gone silent." Captured U-boat crews told similar stories. One hydrophone operator from U-954, sunk west of Iceland, told British interrogators, "It made no sense. Sometimes we heard them from far away. Then suddenly, nothing. The ships vanished into the sea. It was as if they were ghosts." July 1943, fleet-wide implementation. Within weeks, the modifications spread across the Atlantic Fleet. 847 merchant ships received the water chamber system. By autumn, that number exceeded 2,000. What had begun as an illegal experiment was now a standard refit procedure. The work crews no longer used scrap drums. Shipyards produced proper cylindrical housings, sealed and balanced, filling them with salt water or oil to match weight requirements. Installation time dropped from 60 hours to less than 48 per vessel. Each retrofit cost $20,000, less than 1/10 the price of building a new Liberty ship. And for every ship fitted, the odds of survival improved dramatically. Between May and December 1943, Allied losses fell from 729 ships in the previous 8 months to only 329. U-boat sinkings, meanwhile, tripled. For the first time since the war began, the Atlantic no longer belonged to Germany. Back in Liverpool, Lawson returned to his galley aboard the William Eustace. He cooked breakfast, mopped the floor, and listened to the engines hum, quieter now than they had ever been. When one of the crew asked him if it felt strange to know his idea had changed the war, he just smiled and said, "I didn't change the war. I just made it harder for them to hear us coming." June-July 1943, Western Approaches Command, Liverpool. Inside a cramped operations room filled with cigarette smoke and the endless clatter of typewriters, the results were coming in faster than anyone could process them. Charts pinned to the wall showed the impossible. Losses plummeting, U-boat kills rising, the lifeline across the Atlantic restored. Commander Peter Gretton, now running escort operations, looked at the data and shook his head. "We were bleeding ships 3 months ago," he told a colleague. "Now the bastards can't find us." The acoustic dampening system, once mocked as plumbing on a warship, had become a quiet revolution. Every convoy that left Liverpool carried more modified ships. The engineers perfected the design. Steel chambers welded directly into the propeller shaft housing, water-filled bladders molded to fit engine supports, sealed with rubber gaskets scavenged from aircraft factories. Each modification added 18 tons of weight, but reduced a ship's detectable range by more than 90%. To a German hydrophone, these vessels might as well have vanished into the fog. Admiralty Conference Room, London, July 1, 1943. The men who once laughed at the idea now fought to take credit for it. Dr. Harold Burris presented a technical summary to the Admiralty Board, his voice dry and measured. Preliminary assessments confirmed that controlled water-filled cavities around propulsion systems effectively neutralize vibration transfer into the hull, thus masking acoustic emissions. This phenomenon, though initially identified through unorthodox channels, represents a major advance in naval acoustics. Unorthodox channels. That was as close as Burris came to saying, "A cook figured it out." Admiral Max Horton, seated at the head of the table, cut through the pretense. "Gentlemen," he said, "I don't care who discovered it. It works. And from now on, it's standard procedure. I want every ship in the Atlantic Fleet fitted before the end of the year." There was a pause. Then Horton added quietly, "And someone make sure that American cook gets his papers in order. The man just shortened the war." August 1943, Liverpool dockyards. The installations ran around the clock. Sparks showered the decks as welders sealed steel chambers, the air thick with smoke and the smell of burning paint. Teams of engineers moved from ship to ship, tightening bolts, pumping in seawater, checking gauges. Lawson oversaw them all. He wasn't a naval officer, but everyone treated him like one. His hands were black with grease, his eyes bloodshot from exhaustion. When an engineer complained about weight distribution, Lawson simply said, "Better a heavy ship than a dead one." The men laughed, but they listened. By early autumn, 2,047 merchant vessels and 164 escort ships had received the modifications. It required just over 51,000 tons of steel, less than it took to build 7 Liberty ships. Yet the effect was immeasurable. August-December 1943, the turning tide. The impact was immediate. U-boat radio logs captured after the war told the story from the enemy's perspective. Convoys no longer audible beyond 1 kilometer. Bearings unreliable. Attacks fail. Hydrophone operator reports silence. Cannot distinguish targets. Between May and December, Allied ship losses fell by 55%, while U-boat losses quadrupled. In October alone, Allied escorts sank 25 submarines, the highest monthly total of the entire war. For the first time since 1940, the German Navy abandoned Wolfpack operations in the North Atlantic. Admiral Dönitz recalled his submarines to the Bay of Biscay, calling the ocean a graveyard for U-boats. And yet, the man responsible for the miracle kept cooking breakfast for 30 sailors aboard the William Eustace. November 1943, Admiral Horton's office, London. A letter lay open on Horton's desk. It was from the Ministry of Supply, listing production costs. $20,000 per ship, $6.2 million total program cost. Estimated Allied lives saved, over $4,000. Horton wrote one line across the top of the report before filing it away. The simplest ideas save the most men. He asked his aide, "Where's that American cook now?" "Still at sea, sir. Back with the merchant fleet." Horton smiled faintly. "Then let him stay where he wants. Some men prefer their anonymity." Boston, December 1943. The William Eustace limped into port for overhaul. Lawson finally came ashore after 2 years of convoy duty. His hair had gone gray at the temples. Reporters were waiting for him, tipped off by someone in the Navy. But he refused every interview. "I just noticed something," he said. "Other people did the real work." He took a train home to Massachusetts, walked into his mother's kitchen, and set down a small box. Inside was a tarnished British medal, the British Empire Medal, awarded for meritorious service to Allied shipping. When she asked what it was for, Lawson said only, "Keeping things quiet." Back in the Atlantic, the war pressed on, but the worst was over. Convoys once slaughtered in the mid-ocean gap now crossed safely. British and American escorts hunted submarines with radar, hedgehogs, and sonar, but they owed their newfound advantage to something simpler: silence. In the months that followed, U-boats lost their fearsome reputation. The hunters had become prey. By May 1944, the Battle of the Atlantic was effectively won. May 1945, the war's end. When the guns finally fell silent in Europe, the North Atlantic was calm again. Convoys sailed in daylight without fear. No shadow stalked them from below. The once terrifying gray wolves of Dönitz's fleet lay rusting on the seabed or surrendered in ports from Norway to France. The Battle of the Atlantic had cost more than 70,000 Allied sailors and merchant seamen, but the tide had turned in time. Many in the Admiralty quietly knew why. Not because of new destroyers or codebreakers at Bletchley Park, but because a cook had refused to accept the phrase, "That's impossible." 1946, Post-War Reports. Admiral Sir Max Horton published his memoir the following year. In it, he wrote, "Among the many innovations that secured victory in the Atlantic, radar, high-frequency direction finding, escort carriers, none was as simple or as decisive as Lawson's acoustic dampening system. A cook with no formal training achieved what our finest scientists declared unattainable." Commander Peter Gretton, now back at sea commanding peacetime convoys, echoed the sentiment in his own 1964 book, Convoy Escort Commander. Thomas Patrick Lawson never fired a gun, never stood watch on the bridge, and never commanded a ship. Yet he saved more men than any destroyer captain I ever knew. His genius lay not in knowledge, but in observation, in seeing what everyone else ignored. Production summary, 1943 to 1945. By the war's end, 47 Allied merchant ships had been fitted with Lawson's acoustic dampening system. Royal Navy escort vessels carried the same modification. 51,000 tons of steel had been used, less than enough to build 7 Liberty ships. Total cost, just over $6 million, the price of 4 medium bombers, and the results were staggering. From mid-1943 onward, the Allies lost fewer ships than they could replace. Convoys that once arrived half destroyed now docked with nearly full numbers. Naval historians would later estimate that Lawson's discovery shortened the Atlantic campaign by nearly a year and saved at least 4,200 lives. 1947, the invention's legacy. The United States Navy formally adopted the principle behind Lawson's work. Engineers developed an evolved version for warships, a system that used compressed air bubbles instead of static water chambers to disrupt sound waves. They called it Prairie Masker. It became standard equipment on destroyers, cruisers, and submarines throughout the Cold War. Even today, every major surface vessel in the U.S. Navy carries some descendant of Lawson's quiet ship concept. Modern naval manuals describe the system as an acoustic barrier isolating machinery noise from surrounding seawater. The words are dry, technical, but the origin was anything but. It came from a man with grease-stained hands, sitting in a sweltering engine room, listening carefully while others shouted over the roar of turbines. Boston, Massachusetts, late 1940s. Thomas Lawson returned home a changed man. He opened a small diner in Dorchester, a narrow counter, 8 stools, the smell of coffee and fried eggs. When locals asked about the war, he said he just cooked for sailors. There were no medals on the wall, no photographs, no mention of the acoustic system that silenced the Atlantic. In 1951, he married a schoolteacher named Margaret O'Neill, and together they raised 3 children. To them, he was simply Dad. He taught his son how to season stew, his daughter how to listen before speaking. Lessons born from a lifetime of patience. He refused interviews. When the New York Times reached out in 1947, he politely declined. I only pointed something out. Other people did the work. The Admiralty kept his file classified for decades. When it was finally declassified in 1978, a British naval historian tracked him down. Lawson answered the door in a flour-stained apron. "You're the man who made ships quiet," the historian said. Lawson just laughed. "I was the man who made breakfast." He agreed to one interview, off the record, and insisted that the real credit belonged to the engineers who listened when they didn't have to. 1991, the final chapter. Thomas Patrick Lawson passed away in his sleep at the age of 76. His obituary in the Boston Globe described him as a retired restaurant owner and merchant marine veteran. There was no mention of the Battle of the Atlantic, no medals, no inventions. At his funeral, 3 elderly British naval officers attended unannounced. They had served on convoys in 1943 and survived because of his idea. Before the coffin was closed, one of them placed a folded note inside. It read, "Because of you, we came home. 2011, U.S. Naval Academy, Annapolis." Nearly 70 years after Lawson's discovery, a quiet lecture hall filled with cadets listened as an instructor projected a black-and-white photograph of a Liberty ship on the screen. The caption read, "Convoy on 184, April 1943. The instructor said, "Gentlemen, this is the convoy that changed everything." He told them about a cook who noticed something no scientist did, who refused to accept that the sound of engines meant defeat, and who dared to speak when everyone told him to keep quiet. He ended the lecture with a single line that would later appear in the Academy's leadership curriculum. "Innovation doesn't require credentials, only courage, curiosity, and the will to challenge what everyone else accepts." On the slide beside him was a note found in Lawson's coffin. "Because of you, we came home." The cadets sat in silence for a moment. Then one raised his hand. "Sir, what happened to him after the war?" The instructor smiled faintly. "He went home and made breakfast. Today, Every surface warship in the U.S. Navy carries a descendant of his idea. The Prairie Masker system that hums quietly through the hulls of Arleigh Burke-class destroyers and Ticonderoga cruisers is built on the same principle. Sound isolation through controlled acoustics. It is the direct heir to a discovery born not from laboratories or command centers, but from the sweltering engine room of a freighter in 1943. Naval engineers call it active noise cancellation. Sailors still call it something simpler: silence. And silence, in the Atlantic, once meant survival. The lesson. Thomas Patrick Lawson's story remains one of the great unspoken miracles of the Second World War, a reminder that genius doesn't always wear medals or hold rank. It listens. It notices. It refuses to look away from the small things everyone else ignores. When he crouched beside a roaring engine in the belly of the William Eustis, Lawson didn't think about saving the Atlantic or changing naval warfare. He just paid attention. And in doing so, he gave thousands of men something priceless: the chance to live. The ocean is full of noise: the wind, the waves, the endless pulse of machinery. But sometimes, the thing that turns the tide isn't the loudest voice in the room. It's the quiet one that says, "Wait, what if we did it differently?" Because in every war, in every generation, progress begins the same way. With one person who sees what everyone else missed and has the courage to speak. And that, more than steel, more than ships, more than sonar, is how silence won the Battle of the Atlantic. If this story moved you, take a moment to subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments. It really helps the channel grow and lets us keep bringing you more untold history. Because remembering these men depends on people like you.